He spent his final years turning down millions of dollars, hiding from the cameras that once loved him, and quietly nursing a wound that never healed. When Dean Martin died on Christmas Day in 1995, the world remembered the smiling crooner with a drink in his hand and a joke on his lips. But behind closed doors, his children were about to discover something that would leave them in tears, not just because of what their father left behind, but because of everything it represented. This is the real story of Dean Martin, the poor immigrant's son who built an empire, lost the thing he loved most, and left a legacy so powerful it still moves his family to this day. Dean Martin was born Dino Paul Crocetti on June 7, 1917, in Steubenville, Ohio, a small steel town on the banks of the Ohio River. His parents had come from Italy searching for a better life, and like so many immigrant families of that era, they held on to their language and their traditions even as the world around them changed. Dino grew up speaking only Italian at home, and when he started school at the age of 5, he barely understood a word his classmates or teachers said. The other children mocked his accent and his name, and for a shy little boy trying to find his place in a new country, school became a source of constant embarrassment. Rather than let it break him, Dino discovered something that would define the rest of his life: humor. He realized that if he could make the other kids laugh, they stopped laughing at him. That simple survival instinct, born out of a lonely classroom in Ohio, would one day charm audiences across the entire world. As he grew older, Dino found another outlet for his energy. He picked up the drums and fell in love with performing, drawn to the rhythm and the spotlight even before he understood what either one really meant. But music alone didn't pay the bills, and by 16 he had already dropped out of school, convinced that the classroom had nothing left to teach him. He took whatever work he could find, including brutal shifts in a steel mill, where the heat and the noise and the exhaustion were unlike anything a teenager should have to endure. Looking for another way out, he even tried his hand at boxing, fighting under the name Kid Crochet. He later joked that out of the dozen or so fights he had, he only won a handful, and the sport left him with a broken nose and scarred knuckles that stayed with him for the rest of his life. During Prohibition, like many young men trying to survive in a hard economic climate, he found himself running liquor and dealing cards in underground gambling rooms. It was a dangerous world, but it toughened him and gave him the easy, unshakable confidence that would later become his trademark on stage. By the early 1940s, Dino had started singing in small nightclubs, performing under the stage name Dino Martini as a nod to the famous opera tenor Nino Martini. His voice was smooth, relaxed, and effortlessly cool, and it didn't take long for people in the business to notice. A bandleader by the name of Sammy Watkins heard him sing and suggested he change his name to something more marketable for American audiences. That's how Dino Crocetti became Dean Martin, the name that would soon be known around the world. His rise wasn't instant. He bombed during an early performance at a prestigious New York club, an experience that could have ended a less determined man's career before it started. Instead, he kept working, kept refining his sound, and kept believing that his moment was still ahead of him. That moment arrived in 1946, when Dean crossed paths with a young, largely unknown comedian named Jerry Lewis at a New York City nightclub. At the time, Dean was already an established singer with a smooth, polished act, while Jerry was still scrambling to find an audience for his frantic, physical brand of comedy. According to the story that has been told and retold for decades, the two ended up on stage together almost by accident, with Jerry interrupting Dean's set with wild jokes and slapstick antics. What could have been a disaster turned into something electric. The crowd couldn't get enough of the contrast between Dean's cool, confident singing and Jerry's chaotic energy, and the two men quickly realized they had stumbled onto something special. Their official debut as a duo came in the summer of 1946 at a nightclub in Atlantic City, where they were originally booked as separate acts before deciding, almost on a whim, to combine their sets. There was no script. Jerry would crash into Dean's performance, knocking over props and cracking jokes, while Dean played along with an easy smile, never once losing his cool. Audiences had never seen anything quite like it, and word spread fast. Within a few short years, Martin and Lewis were headlining the biggest clubs in the country, hosting their own hit radio program and starring together in a string of hugely successful films. Then came television, where their variety show in the early 1950s turned into one of the most watched programs in America. They didn't stick to scripts. They improvised, joked around, and let the chaos of live television work in their favor, creating a loose, unpredictable style of entertainment that would go on to influence sketch comedy for generations. For a while, Martin and Lewis were, by nearly every measure, the biggest entertainers on the planet. They were pulling in extraordinary sums of money from nightclub performances, film contracts, and television deals, numbers that would be worth many times more in today's economy. But as their fame grew, so did the tension between them. Dean began to feel like he was nothing more than a straight man, standing beside Jerry while the comedian got the biggest laughs and the lion's share of the credit. It bothered him more than he let on in public. Behind the scenes, the two men were also simply very different people. Jerry was a perfectionist who wanted to rehearse every detail until it was perfect, while Dean preferred to keep things loose and would rather be on a golf course than stuck in a rehearsal room. Those differences, small at first, slowly widened into a real rift. By the mid-1950s, the cracks had become impossible to ignore. Dean grew tired of feeling like an afterthought in his own act, and the public seemed to reinforce that feeling, often praising Jerry's talent while barely mentioning Dean's contribution at all. The frustration built for years until it finally became too much for either of them to ignore. Their partnership came to an end in 1956, exactly 10 years after that first spontaneous performance in Atlantic City. Their final show together as a duo was an emotional one, filled with old routines and familiar songs, and by all accounts the audience sensed that they were witnessing the end of an era. When the curtain came down, so did one of the most successful partnerships in entertainment history. Many people assumed that without Jerry Lewis, Dean Martin's career would fade quietly into the background. Instead, he did something remarkable. Rather than trying to reinvent himself as rock and roll swept through the music industry, Dean simply kept being himself, leaning into the smooth, unbothered charm that had always set him apart. He started taking on more serious acting roles, proving to critics and audiences alike that he was more than just a nightclub singer with good comic timing. His performance in a major war drama, alongside some of Hollywood's biggest names, helped rebuild his reputation as a genuine actor, not just an entertainer riding on the coattails of a former partner. At the same time, his music career reached new heights. He signed with a major record label and released a string of hit songs throughout the late 1950s and into the 1960s, culminating in a massive hit in 1964 that famously knocked the Beatles out of the top spot on the charts, a remarkable feat during the height of Beatlemania. Around this same period, Dean became a central figure in one of the most legendary groups in entertainment history, a tight-knit circle of performers that included Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., Joey Bishop, and Peter Lawford. Together, they became the undisputed kings of Las Vegas, filling showrooms night after night with a mix of music, comedy, and effortless charisma that felt like nothing the audience had ever experienced. Dean's laid-back stage persona, often seen with a drink in hand, sipping and joking his way through a set, became one of the most recognizable images in American entertainment. It didn't matter that some of it was for show. Audiences loved the illusion of a man who never seemed to take himself too seriously, and that illusion made him one of the most beloved performers of his generation. Hollywood came calling again, too. Dean appeared in a string of successful films throughout the late 1950s and 1960s, including a heist movie with the rest of his famous circle of friends that would later inspire modern remakes decades later. He continued to blend music and acting seamlessly, bringing his easy charm to nearly every project he touched. But it was television that ultimately cemented his legacy as one of the biggest stars of his era. His own variety show ran for nearly a decade, starting in the mid-1960s, becoming a fixture in American living rooms and one of the most popular programs on network television. The format leaned heavily into his relaxed, off-the-cuff personality, often making it seem as though he was barely rehearsed at all, even though there was far more structure behind the scenes than audiences realized. When ratings eventually began to slip, The show evolved into a series of celebrity roasts, where Dean would host a rotating cast of famous guests, poking fun at one honoree in a way that felt edgy but never truly mean-spirited. Those roasts became a beloved institution in their own right, further cementing Dean's reputation as one of the sharpest, funniest men in show business. Behind all of that fame and success, Dean Martin's personal life was far more complicated than his easygoing public image suggested. He was married 3 times over the course of his life. His first marriage, in the early 1940s, produced 4 children before ending in divorce as his career began to take off. His second marriage lasted more than 2 decades and produced 3 more children, and even after that marriage also ended in divorce, Dean and his former wife remained close, working together to raise their children and support one another through difficult times. His third marriage came later in life and included the adoption of a stepdaughter whom he treated with the same love and care as his biological children. In total, Dean Martin was father to 8 children, and despite the demands of his career and the complexities of his personal relationships, those who knew the family well have often described him as a devoted father who made a genuine effort to stay close to all of his kids, regardless of which marriage they came from. Then in 1987, tragedy struck in a way that would change everything. Dean's son, a former professional athlete and National Guard pilot, was killed when his military jet crashed into a mountain during a training exercise. He was only in his mid-30s. For a man who had weathered public breakups, industry rivalries, and the ordinary ups and downs of a decades-long career, nothing could have prepared him for the loss of his own child. Those close to him noticed an immediate and permanent change. The man who had built his entire career on effortless charm and a devil-may-care attitude became quieter, more withdrawn, and visibly weighed down by grief. He turned down major offers that would have once been irresistible to him, including a highly anticipated reunion tour with old friends from his Rat Pack days. The spotlight that had defined his entire adult life suddenly felt unbearable, and he began to step away from it almost entirely. In the years that followed, Dean lived a much quieter existence. He spent his afternoons on the golf course, one of the few places where he still seemed to find genuine peace. He watched old Western films, the kind of simple, familiar stories that offered comfort rather than complexity. He kept a small circle of close friends and largely avoided the Hollywood scene that had once been the center of his world. It wasn't that he had lost his talent or his charm. It was that the loss of his son had reshaped what mattered to him, and fame no longer held the same appeal it once did. He lived out his final years in relative solitude, choosing comfort and familiarity over the spotlight that had defined so much of his life. When Dean Martin passed away on Christmas Day in 1995, he left behind not only decades of unforgettable music and film, but also a substantial estate built from a lifetime of hard work. His wealth had come from every corner of the entertainment industry, from record sales and film royalties to live performances and television deals stretching back to the 1940s. He had also made smart investments outside of show business, including real estate. He purchased a home in Beverly Hills that he expanded into a sprawling estate, a property that would go on to be resold multiple times over the following decade for prices far higher than what he had originally paid, reflecting just how much the Los Angeles real estate market had grown since his death. He also owned a home in Palm Springs, another piece of property that added to the overall value of his estate. To ensure his family would continue to benefit from his life's work long after he was gone, Dean established a family trust designed to manage the royalties from his music, his television appearances, and any future licensing agreements tied to his name and image. That decision proved to be remarkably forward-thinking. Decades after his death, his music and his classic television specials continued to find new audiences, especially as streaming platforms and social media have introduced his work to generations of fans who never saw him perform live. In recent years, formal partnerships have been established specifically to manage and modernize his legacy, developing new merchandise, licensing deals, and even exploring film projects based on his remarkable life story. These efforts don't just keep his name alive in the cultural conversation. They also continued to generate income for the family he left behind. Dividing that legacy among 8 children, each with a different relationship to their father and different memories of him, was never going to be simple. Estate matters involving royalties, image rights, and ongoing licensing agreements are complicated even in the best of circumstances, and for Dean's children, navigating those details while also processing the loss of their father added an emotional weight that money alone could never erase. Several of his children have spent the years since his passing working to protect and honor his memory in their own ways. One of his daughters has performed his songs on stages around the world, shared personal stories about growing up in a shadow, and even written a memoir reflecting on what it was truly like to be raised by one of the most famous entertainers of the 20th century. She has also helped organize an annual festival in his honor in his Ohio hometown, an event that celebrates his legacy while also supporting scholarships for young musicians just beginning their own careers. What makes Dean Martin's story so enduring isn't just the scale of his success, though by any measure it was extraordinary for a kid who grew up speaking broken English in a steel town. It's the way his story is bookended by 2 very human truths. He built an empire out of nothing, using little more than charm, resilience, and an unshakable sense of humor that he first developed as a lonely 5-year-old trying to survive the schoolyard. And at the height of that success, he lost the one thing that fame and fortune could never protect him from: the safety of his own child. The fortune he left behind wasn't just measured in dollars and property values. It was measured in the music that still plays today, the stories his children continue to tell, and the quiet, complicated love of a father who never stopped trying to hold his family together, even when his own heart was breaking. That combination of triumph and heartbreak is exactly why, decades after his death, people are still moved to tears when they hear the full story of the man behind the smooth voice and the easy smile, the poor immigrant's son from Steubenville, Ohio, who became the king of cool.